The M3 Lee arrived on the battlefield not with fanfare, but with necessity. It was 1941, and the war in North Africa had taken a grim turn for the Allies. The German Afrika Korps, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, had quickly proven their supremacy in armor with the Panzer III and IV, backed by fast-moving forces that outclassed the British tanks they faced. The British Crusader and Matilda, though tough, were not enough to turn the tide. Worse yet, the Americans, still in the process of ramping up production and not yet deeply involved in the fight, faced a serious dilemma. They didn't have the tanks they needed to compete. The Sherman was still in development, and the heavy tanks required to match the German Panzers, machines with thick armor and powerful guns, seemed a distant dream. That's when the M3 Lee emerged. The M3 Lee was an oddity in the world of tank design, a compromise between necessity and ingenuity. Designed by the U.S. Ordnance Department, it was hastily created in response to the desperate need for armored support during the early months of American entry into World War II. The Lee was not a tank that would become a legend in the traditional sense. It was cumbersome, with its turret mounted off-center, leaving the 75mm main gun in a fixed position rather than a fully rotating turret. The gun could fire high-explosive shells, but it lacked the ability to fully engage German tanks with its main weapon alone. It carried a secondary 37mm gun, which would prove useless against the armor of the Panzers. Its armor was thinner than that of its German counterparts, especially in the crucial areas of the hull, and its distinctive tall profile made it an easy target for German anti-tank gunners. Yet despite these apparent shortcomings, the M3 Lee became the tank that filled the gap at a time when there was little else to rely on. Its delivery to the battlefield was a stroke of necessity rather than strategy, filling a crucial gap in the Allied armored units that were stretched thin. As it landed in North Africa in late 1941, American tankers greeted it with a mixture of wariness and hope. They knew it wasn't perfect, but they also knew that anything with a gun mounted on it, with armor thick enough to withstand some hits, and the ability to take the fight to Rommel's forces was a welcome addition to the fight. American tankers in North Africa had already faced the harsh reality of tank warfare, encountering the fearsome German Panzers, whose 75mm guns and sloped armor made short work of the Shermans they had available at the time. The M3 Lee arrived as a stopgap. It wasn't meant to be a game changer. It wasn't designed to be a masterpiece of tank design, but it would prove to be something more important in the brutal desert campaign. It would prove to be an unexpected hero. While the design was less than ideal, the Lee's ability to take punishment and keep moving in a way no other tank had been able to do was a revelation. M3 Lee's first real trial came in the sands of North Africa, where Allied forces were locked in a brutal struggle to prevent Rommel's forces from sweeping across Egypt and reaching the vital Suez Canal. In the hellish environment of the desert, the M3 Lee, with its heavier armament and slightly more durable armor compared to the lighter tanks it replaced, quickly proved itself a more reliable presence. As the dust settled after its first encounters with the Germans, tankers found themselves stunned. For all its flaws, the M3 Lee was more resilient than they had anticipated. It could withstand hits from German 50mm and 75mm guns, hits that would have shredded a lighter tank. In a tank battle where every inch of armor mattered, the Lee held on longer than anyone had expected. It became evident that while the M3 Lee was far from perfect, it was tougher than expected, and toughness could sometimes win the day. Reports from the front soon trickled back to Allied command. The M3 Lee can take hits and keep fighting. In the thick of the North African desert, where the terrain itself was a harsh enemy, the M3 Lee's resilience became its defining feature. When other tanks would have been knocked out of action, either by gunfire or mechanical failure, M3 Lee tanks stayed in the fight, firing back. Several accounts from tankers detailed moments when their M3 Lee tanks, after being hit multiple times by German fire, were still able to keep moving, advancing and taking on new targets. One particular story became legendary. A single M3 Lee, after receiving a hit from a German 50mm gun that shattered its tracks, was still able to limp back to Allied lines under its own power, all the while engaging infantry and machine gunners that had attempted to overrun the tank. The crews quickly realized that M3 Lee's ability to keep moving under fire gave it an edge in combat situations. It wasn't as fast or maneuverable as the Germans' more advanced models, but when a tank could survive hit after hit and still keep firing, it became a force to be reckoned with. Allied tankers found that even in the face of overwhelming odds,
the Lee's ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting helped bolster morale. It wasn't glamorous or heroic, it was gritty and raw, much like the desert itself. Yet it worked. As the war dragged on and the Allies pressed forward through North Africa, the M3 Lee remained a stubborn pillar in the desert battlefields. The tank's toughness became a symbol of persistence. For many tank crews, it was a reminder that even when the odds were stacked against them, the fight wasn't over until the tank stopped moving. And the M3 Lee had a remarkable way of keeping moving no matter how many times it was hit. In the end, the M3 Lee's real strength was not in its design or its firepower, but in its ability to endure in the most unforgiving conditions. This tank, built with compromises, ultimately turned out to be a lesson in resilience. Its toughness would lay the foundation for the future of American tank warfare, showing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from technological superiority, but from the ability to stand tall in the face of adversity. For the men who fought in M3 Lees, it was a reminder that in war, staying in the fight could be the most important victory of all. The M3 Lee was not the tank America wanted, but it was exactly the tank America needed at the time. And in that, it became an unexpected hero of the war.
The first time the M3 Lee rolled into battle under fire, no one, not the Germans, not the British, not even the American crew sitting inside it, was truly prepared for what would happen. North Africa in early 1942 was a place where reputations were made and destroyed in a matter of minutes. The desert could turn a tank into a furnace, a crewman into a ghost, and the inexperienced into casualties before they had even fired a shot. And into this crucible came the M3 Lee, tall, awkward, under-armored, and carrying a design philosophy that seemed almost antique compared to the sleek killing machine efficiency of the German panzers. Nobody expected much. Some expected failure. A few expected catastrophe. What they got instead was surprise. Violent, metallic, unforgettable surprise. The first real test came near Gazala, where Rommel had been maneuvering aggressively, smashing British lines with fast panzer thrusts supported by deadly 50mm anti-tank guns. The Afrika Korps had grown used to Allied tanks that burst into flames after one or two hits. They expected the same from the new American machines arriving in British service. From a distance, the M3 Lee's silhouette was unmistakable, a towering structure with multiple guns jutting out from different angles. German gunners reportedly laughed when they first saw it through their optics, calling it a metal barn on tracks. To them, the tall profile meant one thing, an easy kill. But when the German 50mm shells began to hit, something unexpected happened. The M3 Lee did not die. Shells struck the front glasses, sending sparks and bursts of sand into the air. The first round dented the armor. The second cracked a weld seam. The third punched through an external stowage box but failed to breach the crew compartment. Inside, the American crew braced for the worst, expecting the vehicle to erupt into flames. But the tank kept moving, its engine roaring as if refusing to die. Then the 75mm sponson gun spoke. Its blast echoed across the dunes, sending a high-explosive shell slamming into a German gun pit. Sand and metal flew into the air. The German crew dove for cover. The M3 Lee was still alive, and it was angry. As the tank rumbled forward, the turret-mounted 37mm gun joined the fight, firing on infantry positions scrambling between dunes. The dual gun setup, awkward on paper, suddenly made sense on the battlefield. The 75mm suppressed enemy anti-tank guns, while the 37mm picked off softer targets. German forward observers radioed in disbelief. The tall American tank, it continues to advance despite multiple hits. For the first time in months, Rommel's gunners were forced to reload frantically, recalibrate their sights, and double-check their range. They had underestimated the M3 Lee's resilience, a mistake that would cost them dearly. One engagement around Bir Hakeim became legendary in after-action reports. A formation of M3 Lees, accompanied by British Grant variants, advanced across open ground to support isolated infantry units. The Germans opened fire with a mix of 50mm pot guns and long-barreled Panzer III tanks. Shells hammered the American tanks. Several Lees took direct hits, cracked armor plates, shattered periscopes, disabled track links. In any other tank of the era, this would have been the end. But the M3 Lee crews refused to bail out. They kept driving, kept firing, kept pushing forward. And then the unexpected happened. One immobilized Lee, still able to rotate its turret, continued firing for nearly 20 minutes, forcing a German anti-tank crew to abandon their gun and retreat. Later, when infantry inspected the battlefield, they found the Lee had taken seven hits from German 50mm cannons and never lost turret rotation. The sponson gun remained intact. The engine compartment was damaged, but not destroyed.
One crewman wrote later, "We thought we were dead 3 times that day. The Lee decided otherwise." Stories like this spread quickly through the ranks. Crews who had once joked about the tank's ungainly appearance now spoke about its surprising toughness. German troops too grew cautious. Some called the Lee der Sach-Armee, the stubborn American. Its impact was not limited to duels with anti-tank guns. During the chaotic fighting around Knightsbridge, several M3 Lees supported a British armored brigade under heavy attack. A German Panzer III scored multiple hits on one of the Lees, cracking open the hull around the driver's port. The crew was shaken but unhurt. Instead of retreating, the Lee returned fire with its 75mm, striking the Panzer at an angle that tore through its side armor. The German tank erupted in flames. Nearby crews watched in shock. A tank that looked like a factory mistake had just beaten a seasoned Panzer III in a head-to-head shootout. This was the moment soldiers began to understand a truth that wasn't written in any manual. The M3 Lee was tougher than it looked. It did not win battles through elegance or superior engineering, it won through stubbornness, through armor that held together long enough for crews to get off the shot that mattered, through redundant systems that allowed it to fight even when damaged, through pure mechanical will. It was not the tank the Americans had dreamed of sending to war, but it was the one that arrived when the Allies needed something, anything that could stand against the Afrika Korps. By the end of its first major engagements, skepticism had turned into respect. The M3 Lee was not perfect, it was not even great. But in those desperate early battles in North Africa, when the balance of power was fragile and the future uncertain, the M3 Lee proved one thing beyond doubt. It could take hits, far more than anyone had expected, and it could keep fighting.
The desert was a cruel judge of machines. It punished every weakness: overheating engines, clogged air filters, fragile gearboxes, brittle weld seams, until only the toughest remained. And in that furnace of sand and steel, the M3 Lee revealed a hidden strength no blueprint or training manual had ever mentioned. It was a survivor. Not elegant, not fearsome, not technologically superior, just stubbornly, infuriatingly hard to kill. American and British crews who had once rolled their eyes at the Lee's clumsy silhouette soon found themselves relying on it in ways they had never imagined. If the Sherman was a well-balanced contender and the Tiger a deadly predator, then the M3 Lee was something closer to a bulldog, stocky, bruised, scarred, but always getting back up for another round. One of the earliest confirmations of the Lee's resilience came during the tangled battles near Gazala in mid-1942, where Allied forces found themselves outmaneuvered by Rommel's Afrika Korps. In the chaos, a platoon of M3 Lees from the U.S. 1st Armored Division was tasked with reinforcing a crumbling infantry line. As the Lees advanced, they immediately drew fire from a ridge held by German POC-38 crews. The 50mm guns opened up at once, sending a chain of armor-piercing rounds straight into the column. The first Lee took a hit on the upper hull. Armor buckled, but didn't break. The second was struck on the turret ring, jamming the rotation but leaving the 75mm gun fully operational. The third hit twice in rapid succession, lost its radio, but retained full mobility. The line should have shattered. Instead, the Lees kept advancing like wounded animals refusing to die. German gun crews, used to seeing British Crusaders explode after 2 or 3 hits, were stunned. They adjusted their sights, fired again, and watched in frustration as the Lees replied with 75mm blasts that forced them to scramble for cover. Later, when engineers inspected the surviving tanks, they found something remarkable. Several armor plates were bent inward like crushed tin, but the structural frame remained intact. It looked like a fist had punched the hull, one mechanic said, but the damn thing still ran. This became the unofficial description of the M3 Lee, punched but running. Even more astonishing were the accounts from crews who experienced catastrophic-sounding hits but stayed in the fight anyway. In one engagement near El Adam, a Lee commander reported hearing a massive crack as a German round struck the sponson armor beside the 75mm gun. Dust filled the fighting compartment. Rivets flew like shrapnel. The gun shield dented inward. The loader briefly thought they were dead, but when the smoke cleared, the gun still traversed, the breech still locked, and the firing mechanism still worked. Shaking off the shock, the crew loaded another shell and fired. According to infantry who witnessed the duel, the battered Lee looked like it should have fallen apart, but instead it barked back like a wounded dog. Stories like these spread quickly across North Africa. Tankers are superstitious by nature, and soon crews began referring to certain Lees as lucky hulls, machines that seemed to absorb impossible punishment. One particular tank, nicknamed Old Salt, survived 9 confirmed hits over 3 engagements. On one occasion, after taking a direct shot that blew open a side access panel, the crew simply welded a spare toolbox over the gap and returned to battle 2 hours later. The Germans hit it again days later, this time shattering the commander's cupola. The crew replaced it with a salvage hatch from a wrecked British Grant and kept fighting. Old Salt was eventually retired due to transmission failure, not enemy fire. Its hull, now scarred like an ancient warrior shield, became a minor legend in the division. Part of the M3 Lee's resilience lay in its strange design. What engineers had seen as flaws, multiple compartments, redundant guns, dispersed crew positions, turned out to provide unexpected survival benefits. A hit that disabled the 37mm turret gun often left the 75mm sponson gun untouched. A breach on the right side of the hull might injure the radio operator but leave the driver and gun crew still fully functional. Even mobility kills were sometimes temporary. The Lee's simple suspension and accessible track components allowed mechanics to perform miracles under fire. One field repair team near Mersa Matruh replaced a broken bogey wheel in under 30 minutes while shells exploded in the distance. The tank was back in the fight before the smoke settled. American crews quickly learned field expediency. They packed sandbags along the hull, they welded spare track sections across the front glacis, they reinforced weak points with boxes, canisters, and scrap metal. The Lee, more than any other tank of the early war, became a rolling laboratory for improvisation. And because its structure was forgiving, these additions actually worked. A Lee crew from the 13th Armored Regiment once credited 2 layers of spare track lengths for stopping a German round that would have penetrated the driver port. "We survived because we carried our junk," the driver joked. But the truth was more profound. The M3 Lee invited creativity because it could accommodate it. Morale also changed. Tankers who had once feared the desert's open killing fields now had something they could trust, not to protect them completely, but to give them a fighting chance. A machine that didn't explode after the first hit, that didn't cripple after the second, that didn't surrender its crew after the third. This mattered more than technology. It gave them time. Time to fire back, time to maneuver, time to escape, time to live. German reports captured after the war confirmed what Allied crews already knew. Panzer commanders wrote with irritation that the American Lee tank does not fall to normal fire as expected. One Africa Corps officer complained that Lees behave like damaged trucks, still moving even after serious hits. It wasn't meant as a compliment, but it might as well have been. By late 1942, the M3 Lee had earned a strange and unexpected reputation. The tank that shouldn't work, but does. The tank that shouldn't survive, but keeps living. The tank that soldiers mocked when they first saw it, but trusted when the shells started falling. It was flawed, awkward, outdated by 1943 standards, but in those critical early months in North Africa, the M3 Lee did what mattered most. It stayed in the fight, every time.
If the M3 Lee had one true superpower, it wasn't its guns, its armor, or its engine. It was the fact that it refused to die. And, even more incredibly, that it could be resurrected right there on the battlefield. In North Africa, where logistics were stretched thin and battle lines moved constantly, a tank that could be brought back from the brink in minutes, not days, was worth its weight in gold. And the M3 Lee, with its boxy hull and straightforward mechanical layout, became the most repairable tank in the desert. What it lacked in elegance, it made up for in practicality. Its very simplicity turned into a battlefield advantage that no one foresaw. To understand why this mattered, one must understand the brutal arithmetic of desert warfare. Every tank lost wasn't simply a machine gone. It meant a weakened line, a vulnerable flank, a crew walking back across burning sand under enemy fire. And the Africa Corps, with their disciplined gun crews and precise tactics, made sure that every hit counted. Allied tankers quickly realized that bringing a damaged Lee back into action, even if it looked like a twisted metal monster, could be the difference between holding a ridge and losing an entire battalion. Field repairs became almost a ritual. Scenes of mechanics working under the blistering sun became part of daily life. Sparks from welding torches cutting through the desert heat, men hammering on bent plates, crews tightening bolts with hands still shaking from battle. And the Lee, unlike many other tanks, seemed designed to tolerate this rough treatment. Its internal layout, though criticized by engineers back home, gave crews access to most essential components without needing to dismantle half the tank. Where a British Crusader required workshop-level disassembly to reach its transmission, the Lee allowed mechanics to lift panels and get straight to work. One of the most remarkable examples came from the fighting near Sidi Rezegh. A Lee took 3 hits in quick succession. One blew apart its right side track links, another shattered the sponson plate around the 75mm gun, and the last tore open a storage box, scattering ammunition across the sand. By all accounts, that should have been the end of it. But the crew didn't abandon the tank. They radioed back, held their position with the 37mm turret gun, and waited. Within an hour, under fire, American and British repair teams dragged replacement track links through the sand, jacked the tank up, and began bolting the new parts on. The crew climbed out, covered in sweat and soot, helping push the track into place. Shells whistled overhead. Shrapnel kicked up sand. Yet 20 minutes later, the Lee lurched forward again, scarred, patched up, but very much alive. Stories like that traveled fast. They became almost mythic, told and retold in mess tents, replacing early jokes about the M3's ugly silhouette with something closer to respect. Mechanics began competing to see how fast they could turn a wrecked Lee back into a fighting machine. Some teams could swap out a road wheel in under 15 minutes. Others welded entire armor panels scavenged from wrecked vehicles onto surviving Lees, turning them into bizarre but effective hybrids. There was even an incident where a Lee, having lost its 37mm turret to a direct hit, had the open turret hole covered with a steel sheet and returned to combat, its crew fighting on with only the 75mm gun and their machine guns. They nicknamed it the One-Eyed Mule, and it continued serving for weeks. The Germans noticed. Reports from Afrika Korps units noted with irritation that American tanks reappeared shortly after being disabled, often patched together with field-made armor plates of crude but effective nature. German officers prided themselves on precision engineering, everything built to exact tolerances. But in the desert, this became a liability. Their tanks needed specialized parts, specialist teams, and carefully maintained supply lines. A broken idler wheel or damaged transmission could sideline a Panzer for days. The Lee, by contrast, was an open invitation. Rip out the broken part, hammer the bent piece, weld what you can, bolt the rest, and drive. This resilience created a new kind of psychological impact. Tank crews began to trust their machines, not because the M3 Lee was safe, but because it wouldn't abandon them easily. One American gunner said it best. A Lee didn't quit. If the engine still coughed and the gun still barked, she was good to go. And this mattered. At a time when the Allies were still learning armored warfare and still adjusting to German tactics, confidence was a precious resource. Confidence in a tank that could return from the dead was priceless. Perhaps the most dramatic example of battlefield resurrection came during Operation Crusader. A Lee took a hit that tore open the sponson around the 75mm, blasting molten metal into the gun housing and seizing the recoil mechanism. The crew bailed out, believing the tank finished. But when British engineers arrived, they saw the hull was still structurally sound. They replaced the damaged recoil system with parts scavenged from 2 different wrecked Lees, hammered the gun mount straight with sledgehammers, patched the breech housing with a steel plate from a disabled Grant tank, and had the Lee operational again in 6 hours. When the original crew returned, still shaken from the battle, they found their tank waiting for them, smoking, dented, but ready. One crewman swore the tank looked embarrassed for having ever quit. This ability to resurrect itself through both design and sheer stubbornness made the M3 Lee far more valuable than expected. In North Africa, the war was not just about firepower or accuracy. It was about staying in the fight when every mile mattered, when every tank counted, and when reinforcements were weeks away across the Atlantic. The M3 Lee, flawed though it was, became a symbol of that endurance. It showed that a tank didn't need to be perfect to matter. It needed to be present, moving, firing, surviving. And the M3 Lee excelled at all 4. By late 1942, Allied tank brigades had learned a crucial lesson. A tank that could be repaired on the battlefield was worth three that couldn't. The M3 Lee, ungainly and outdated though it appeared, had earned its place in the desert, not through brilliance, but through persistence. And in war, persistence is often the most powerful weapon of all.
When the smoke cleared over Europe and the Pacific in 1945, millions of weapons were abandoned, scrapped, or locked away in warehouses. The world's arsenals were full of relics of a war that had burned itself out: rifles, tanks, and aircraft designs already obsolete by the time peace arrived. But one weapon refused to fade. The Browning M2 HB .50 caliber machine gun was not retired, not replaced, not even modified much. It had survived the largest conflict in human history almost unchanged. And in doing so, it had proven something that every soldier who ever fired one already knew. The Ma Deuce was not just a gun. It was an idea, one so perfect it would outlive its own century. The stories of its endurance began immediately after the war. In Korea, 1950 to 1953, when snow fell on the mountains of the Chosin Reservoir, American Marines found themselves fighting in temperatures colder than Bastogne. M1 rifles jammed, carbines froze solid, but the M2s, the same guns that had roared on Okinawa, kept firing. Mounted on trucks, tanks, and makeshift sandbag nests, they chewed through wave after wave of Chinese assaults. Gunners called it singing in the snow. One veteran said, "You could set your watch to that sound. Every burst meant another minute we were still alive." In Vietnam, it became the thunder that rolled through the jungles. Mounted on Huey gunships, armored convoys, and river patrol boats, the M2HB once again found itself everywhere. The thick canopy of the jungle couldn't silence its voice. It guarded bases, convoys, and villages, spitting fire down trails invisible from the air. The jungle would go quiet. Then the Ma Deuce would talk, and the trees would answer. Through half a century of warfare, the same weapon followed the same formula: air-cooled, recoil-operated, utterly reliable. Soldiers called it the Old Girl, Big 50, or simply Ma. The name stuck because it fit. Like a mother, it protected everything under its reach: jeeps, tanks, ships, aircraft, men. There was something maternal about the way it covered the battlefield, watching, waiting, punishing anything that threatened its children. The weapon's design was so solid that even as technology advanced, lasers, smart bombs, guided missiles, the M2 remained untouched. The US Army tested new versions, new calibers, new mounts. None lasted. Every replacement failed the same test: reliability. The Ma Deuce never jammed when the world depended on it. As one ordnance officer put it, "It doesn't care if you're in mud, snow, or salt water, it just asks for ammo." Even America's enemies couldn't help but respect it. During the Gulf War of 1991, Iraqi soldiers abandoned vehicles when they saw the telltale flash of the 50 cal's tracers. In Afghanistan and Iraq decades later, American convoys still rolled with M2s mounted on their roofs. The sound was the same as it had been in 1944, a deep, rhythmic hammering that could be felt in the chest before it was heard in the ears. Civilians called it the heartbeat of the convoy. What made the M2 eternal wasn't just engineering, it was philosophy. John Browning's vision was simple: make a machine that never quits. No excess, no fragility, no compromise. Every spring, every pin, every groove served a purpose. It could be cleaned with motor oil, repaired with wire, fired until the barrel glowed red. It didn't require faith, it earned it. That design philosophy shaped generations of American weapons afterward, from the M60 to the M240. Yet, none ever replaced her. The Ma Deuce wasn't the ancestor of those guns, she was their queen. In museums today, the M2HB sits behind glass, blackened steel, barrel worn smooth from decades of fire. Visitors walk by without realizing that the weapon in front of them is likely older than their grandparents and is still used by the same army that carried it ashore on D-Day. Soldiers returning from modern deployments say the same thing their grandfathers did. She's heavy, she's loud,
and she never fails. The symbolism of the Ma Deuce runs deeper than its mechanics. It became a sound that defined American warfare. Not chaotic, not frantic, but deliberate and steady. When it fired, it spoke of discipline, persistence in industry. It was the sound of factories in Detroit and Hartford turned into firepower. The echo of a nation that built not just weapons, but endurance. When the M2 fired, the message was clear. We are still here. We are still fighting. In the words of one World War II veteran interviewed in 1989, "We had our rifles, our mortars, our bazookas, but when you heard the 50, you stood taller, because you knew she'd never stop until the fight was done." And so, decade after decade, war after war, the Ma Deuce never left. On guard towers in Afghanistan, her barrel pointed toward the same mountains where Alexander once marched. On Navy ships, she watched over seas where the ghosts of Midway still lingered. On armored trucks rolling through deserts, her muzzle flared red against the night, the same color it had burned in the skies over Normandy 70 years before. It is rare that a machine becomes immortal. Rarer still that it keeps earning its place across generations. Yet somehow, the M2HB did. It outlasted its inventor, its century, and even the wars that gave it purpose. And she remains the one weapon every American soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine knows by name. When the final gun of the 20th century is silenced, and history looks back at the weapons that shaped the world, the Browning .50 caliber will not be remembered just for its firepower. It will be remembered for its faithfulness, for being there when everything else failed. Because from Normandy to Okinawa, from Korea to Kandahar, one truth has never changed. The Ma Deuce never stopped speaking. Her thunder still rolls through the ages, a steel heartbeat echoing across time, a reminder that some machines don't just fight wars, they become them.